Under a rust-red sky that clung to the last hour of dusk, the land behind the iron gate of Grayson Barclay's estate looked like it hadn't changed in 100 years. Sprawling, quiet, and trimmed with a line of old stone markers and native brush, it sat like an island between modern luxury and forgotten permanence. His property wasn't vast in a rancher's sense, but every inch of it felt deliberate. Reclaimed stone paths, a slope of golden hills that broke into a low creek bed, and, farther back, the crown of it all, a weathered storage barn built in the 1890s, restored piece by piece from collapsed beams and hand-forged bolts. Not a museum, not a tourist trap. Grayson used the barn, hosted vintage car gatherings once a season, lent the land for weddings, and stored everything from inherited artifacts to irrigation blueprints and mechanical records. It wasn't just a barn. It was a working spine of the property, and, to those who understood the language of land, a keystone of quiet resistance to synthetic development. And tucked within its northern foundation, sealed beneath stone and wrought iron, was the primary valve of a century-old water distribution system that still, to this day, fed the artificial lake of the Silver Lake Ridge neighborhood. Just beyond his boundary, Grayson had never boasted about it. He didn't need to. The arrangement was old, so old that even most of the current residents didn't realize that their beloved reflective centerpiece, the lake with its aerated fountains and curated shoreline events, existed at the whim of a subterranean mechanism, Grayson, maintained by hand. The valve wasn't electronic. It didn't appear on any modern municipal water grid. It was a legacy clause, protected and reaffirmed by a grandfathered contract that preceded the formation of the neighborhood association by decades. The water rights, like the land they crossed, belonged entirely to him. And because the system required minimal intervention, and because Grayson wasn't a man drawn to conflict or attention, he had quietly maintained it season after season, with the precision of an archivist and the detachment of a man who understood the slow weight of time. He had no ill will toward the neighbors. In fact, he rarely thought of them at all. That changed the morning he found the barn reduced to splinters. He'd been gone for 6 days. A trip upstate, part leisure, part business, part the sort of aimless wandering a man in his late 50s might do when the quiet at home starts to stretch too long. He'd left the property under the informal watch of Carl, his groundskeeper, but Carl wasn't there when he returned. Instead, there was a bright orange ribbon of caution tape looped around 2 metal stakes where the barn had stood, a stack of disturbed soil like the work of some overzealous mole, and, strangest of all, a laminated placard zip-tied to the old fence post that read, in absurdly official font, Community Reclamation, Unsafe Structure Removed Under Public Safety Mandate. The logo in the corner belonged to the Neighborhood Council, the de facto governing body of Silver Lake Ridge. Grayson stood in silence for nearly 3 minutes, not moving, not speaking, just reading the words again and again, as though comprehension could alter their meaning. His barn was gone. He didn't storm over to anyone's house. He didn't shout, didn't call the city, didn't even unlock the gate. Instead, he walked down the gravel path to the side of the house, entered through the utility entrance, and sat down at his long oak kitchen table. There, with the slow deliberation of a man who had been burned before and understood the patience required to dig through ashes, he opened his file drawer and pulled out the red-labeled folder that contained every legal document tied to the property. Water rights, historic structure registration, property boundaries. He placed them in a neat stack, added the last certified inspection report for the barn, dated just under a year ago, and then slid them into a leather portfolio. He didn't call the council. He called his attorney. Jason Lowry wasn't a man for moral arguments or righteous indignation. He was a property lawyer who specialized in land use conflicts and easement violations, and Grayson had hired him 3 years earlier during a brief boundary survey dispute with the county. They hadn't spoken in over a year. Grayson simply told him, My barn's gone. They said it was unsafe. I want the basis." Jason replied without pause. "Send me your documents and the photos. Don't say another word to them." And that was it. No dramatics. No escalation. Just the first thread of what Grayson knew would unravel into something worse. What unsettled him wasn't the barn itself, though that stung. It wasn't even the breach of process, the absence of warning, the lack of citation, the silent violence of a bulldozer sent under false pretenses. What struck him was the choice of location. They didn't touch his garage. They didn't inspect the guest house. They went for the barn, which meant someone had either researched what stood there or guessed, and either outcome made the move feel intentional, coordinated, possibly even sanctioned by someone on the inside who understood what the barn protected. The valve. It was old, manual, temperamental. A lattice of iron gears and spindles that required 2 full turns in opposite directions just to change water flow by 10%. But it worked. The lake's basin had no direct inflow from the river. It was gravity-fed from Grayson's upper aquifer, controlled solely through that system. There were overflow contingencies, emergency drainage catchments, check valves, but the flow in? That was his. And until the day before, it had been housed beneath 5 tons of stabilized foundation stone now lying in a trash pile somewhere near a landfill. By the following afternoon, Jason had confirmed the worst. There was no legal order, no city permit. The mandate referenced in the placard was part of a resolution passed internally by the neighborhood council, an advisory document with no legal standing beyond voluntary compliance. And Grayson hadn't volunteered. The demolition, in legal terms, was trespass and property damage, possibly even malicious mischief depending on provable intent. But Jason was careful. "Let's not lead with fire," he said. "First we pull the records. Then we find out who authorized it. Then we make them nervous." Grayson agreed. He didn't turn the valve. Not yet. But he did inspect it, kneeling in the crater where his barn had once stood, brushing away loose dust and gravel to reveal the iron trap door that, by sheer luck or ignorance, had been left untouched. That told him something. They didn't know what they'd demolished. They had done it for some other reason. Maybe pressure from buyers, maybe some cosmetic initiative, maybe a planned development in need of a staging area. But they hadn't done it to seize the valve. Not yet. He locked the trap door. Then he reinstalled a flush-mount camera above it, buried the power cable under hard soil, and placed a decoy chain link over the opening. After that, he walked the perimeter of the property, counting survey flags placed at odd angles near his southern fence. There were 9, all new. Grayson took photos of each, marking GPS coordinates. He emailed them to Jason, along with one final note. "They think I won't push back. Make sure they understand what's at stake." When the first official inquiry came, thinly disguised as a community planning review request, it wasn't addressed to him, but to a P.O. box listed under an old umbrella LLC he hadn't used in years. That confirmed it. Someone was trying to sidestep him, to route the pressure elsewhere, possibly to force a technical forfeiture by procedural default. That move, above all, told Grayson that the next phase wouldn't be civil. It would be administrative, silent, paper weapons. But he was ready. It was the 3rd morning after the barn's demolition when the second strike came, and this time it arrived not in the form of noise and debris, but with a knock at the door, calculated, precise, and at a time when most would expect a neighbor, or delivery, not confrontation. Grayson answered not with apprehension, but with the calm resolve of someone who'd already guessed that nothing henceforth would be casual. Standing before him was a woman in her early 50s, neatly dressed in a beige pantsuit and holding a leather-bound folder that bore no company name, no insignia, nothing except a small silver pin on her collar, a symbol he didn't recognize but instinctively distrusted. She introduced herself as Karen Holloway, chair of the Silver Lake Neighborhood Planning Committee, a title she delivered with a smile that belonged more to a well-rehearsed sales pitch than a genuine greeting. She did not ask to come in. She simply began talking as though his threshold was a podium and she was already mid-presentation. She spoke of community cohesion, aesthetic consistency, and structural modernization, weaving buzzwords together like camouflage netting, all the while referencing him only indirectly, as if she were addressing a group and not a man whose property had just been unlawfully desecrated. It wasn't until she opened her folder that the mask slipped ever so slightly. She removed a folded document, an architectural rendering printed in color, and held it out with both hands, displaying it like a gift. It was a site plan, rendered digitally, gleaming and idealized, showing a circular promenade flanked by boutique shops, an artificial dock, and an outdoor wine terrace. Dead center, labeled with passive clarity, was the space where Grayson's barn had stood, now marked Plaza Phase 1, Event Hub. Grayson did not reach for the document. He let her hold it. Karen, sensing the lack of engagement, shifted tone. She spoke now of shared future and the power of revitalization. The Silver Lake Board, she explained, had recently secured preliminary interest from a development group that specialized in blended-use luxury enclaves, and the EU proposed plaza was only the beginning. The lakeside needed to evolve, she said. The community deserved more than passive water views and jogging paths. It deserved a destination. Grayson said nothing, and that silence forced her to move to her final point. An offer. It was subtle, implied more than stated, but clear enough for anyone fluent in the language of transactions disguised as cooperation. The council was willing to formalize arrangements with his land, compensation, perhaps even a seat on a heritage advisory board, if he would consent to a partial reclassification of his property as shared green zone. Not a seizure, she assured, a partnership. Grayson simply said, "You demolished a registered structure without authority," then stepped back and closed the door. Behind the wood, he leaned against the frame, not because he was tired, but because the moment demanded stillness, something solid to press into while the implications settled. They hadn't acted recklessly. They'd acted with a vision. And now they were trying to dress that vision in layers of process and polite ambition. But underneath it all was theft. Theft wrapped in diplomacy. He didn't react emotionally. He contacted Jason and relayed the conversation word for word, requested a copy of the development proposal if it had been submitted to the city, and asked for a private investigator, not to tail anyone, but to map connections between the planning committee, Karen Holloway, and whatever firm was behind the proposed plaza. The next escalation was quieter. The irrigation timers on his property failed. The control panel showed a surge, internal, not grid-based. A fuse had been tripped by what looked like a reverse current, not catastrophic, but suspicious. He inspected the lines, found that the panel enclosure had been recently opened despite no service scheduled, and reported the anomaly to Jason, who advised a formal incident log. That same evening, Grayson's mailbox was replaced. Not vandalized. Replaced. The new box was stainless steel with a keypad and a barcode sticker. It matched the new community standard units recently issued to all homes within the residential circle. Grayson's land wasn't in the circle. It wasn't under jurisdiction. Yet someone had acted as if it was, and done so without consent. Grayson removed the new box, placed it beside the demolished barn site, and bolted his original post back into place. He didn't leave a note. He knew it would be seen. The next morning, an envelope arrived, hand-delivered, not mailed. It was folded neatly in thirds, printed on thick stock and sealed with a gold foil sticker that bore the initials SLRC in serif font, Silver Lake Redevelopment Consortium. Inside was a single-page notice, an invitation to a public hearing regarding zoning adjustments, specifically the reclassification of boundary parcels adjacent to the lake. His parcel was circled in red. The language was coded but unmistakable. If the proposal passed, his property could be legally interpreted as falling under a revised community overlay, opening it to regulatory oversight by the very committee that had already overstepped. Jason reviewed the notice and confirmed the maneuver. They were trying to shift the map under his feet. "You need to be at that meeting," Jason said. "I will be," Grayson replied. "But not to make speeches." Over the next 3 days, Grayson doubled his documentation. He brought in a second legal consultant with expertise in infrastructure rights, a retired hydrologist familiar with the valley's water system, and a licensed surveyor to revalidate every edge of his property line. It wasn't theater, it was armor. If they wanted to draw lines, he would present boundaries. If they wanted oversight, he would present the valve. Quietly, he had the original engineering diagrams of the water system professionally scanned and authenticated. He prepared a timeline of flow records, marked anomalies and lake-level changes since the barn's demolition, and filed a request with the Environmental Bureau for an independent assessment of water stability based on recent changes in distribution. By the time the hearing date arrived, Grayson wasn't a man fighting back. He was a man preparing to corner them with their own shadows. The meeting was held in the community hall just off the central plaza, a repurposed chapel with rows of plastic chairs and a mounted projector that flickered under too many fluorescent bulbs. Grayson arrived in a gray wool coat, no entourage, no binder in hand, just his presence. Karen was already there, flanked by 2 assistants and a man in a tailored suit who stood too far from the podium to be a committee member. The hearing opened with procedural statements, followed by a slide presentation outlining the future of lakeside enrichment. When Grayson's parcel appeared on screen, no one mentioned his name. It was referred to as Legacy Lot 37. Detached. Neutralized. Then came public comment. Grayson stood when called. He did not clear his throat or apologize for time. He began with a question. Is this committee aware of the infrastructural dependency that links the lake to my property's underground valve system? A hush followed. Someone said, "Please address the board." Grayson ignored that. He continued, explaining in calm, precise terms the nature of the flow control, the location of the mechanical valve, the dates of the original agreement, and the lack of any formal renegotiation since its filing. Then he produced a single-page summary of recent disruptions, dated, signed by a certified engineer, showing drops in lake levels correlating exactly with his restricted access since the barn's removal. Finally, he turned to the room and stated, "Any expansion plan that fails to account for that infrastructure is not just incomplete, it is negligent." He didn't ask for votes. He didn't threaten legal action. He simply stated facts, then sat down. What followed wasn't drama. It was the sound of recalculation. Eyes shifted. Phones lit up. The man in the tailored suit whispered something to Karen. She responded without looking at him. The board recessed early, citing additional review required. By the time Grayson returned home, 2 things had happened. The revised zoning map on the city website was temporarily pulled for update, and a second envelope was waiting on his doorstep, smaller than the last, sealed in plain white. Inside, no gold sticker, no logo. Just a handwritten note. "Let's find a way to move forward together. K.H." No threat, no apology, just a line, held out, to test whether he would meet her halfway. Grayson folded the note once, twice, 3 times, then placed it into the wood stove and lit a match. Grayson didn't respond to Karen's note. He didn't send a letter, he didn't request a meeting, and he certainly didn't call. His silence wasn't passive, it was tactical. Every day that passed without reaction deepened the discomfort of those who expected him to flinch, protest, or lash out. Silence, in a world obsessed with control, was subversion. The committee, the developers, whoever had sanctioned the destruction of the barn, they needed to know where he stood, but he had already made that clear. The question now was what they were willing to do next. The answer came sooner than expected. 4 days after the public hearing, a utility van marked with a generic logo pulled up to the edge of Grayson's property. 2 men exited wearing safety vests and tool belts. Grayson, standing at a distance near the edge of his grape trellis, watched them through binoculars. They didn't notice him, too focused on the spot just beside the barn's old foundation, near the hatch that protected the valve. They carried a portable scanner, the type used for underground line detection, and a folded map that one of them kept pointing at while the other waved the scanner over the ground like a dowser searching for water. Grayson recorded it all on a long-lens DSLR camera he had used for years to photograph birds. He noted their license plate, their route in, their gear. They remained for 20 minutes before one of them knelt, inserted a metal spike into the earth, and made a marking in orange spray paint. Then they left, not toward the main road but around the side of the neighborhood's construction gate, a shortcut permitted only to authorized personnel. That evening he sent the photos and time log to Jason. "Trespass," Jason replied bluntly. "Oh, soft incursion. They're testing the limits, probing to see if you'll engage again or if you're just noise." Grayson didn't reply immediately. He was outside, walking the line of his southern boundary, noting that 3 more survey flags had appeared, this time closer together, and each driven deeper into the soil. That same week, a new development sign went up across the lake, rendering boards of Phase 2, Culinary Market plus Boardwalk Access, mounted on polished aluminum posts, complete with QR codes linking to virtual tours. On those renderings, his lot was blank space. No barn, no valve, no designation at all. It wasn't being redrawn, it was being erased. The following morning, Grayson discovered the first breach. His side gate, an iron-reinforced panel locked with a triple-pin deadbolt, was ajar. Not forced, not broken, but open. He knew the sound it made when unlatched. He would have heard it in the night. That meant it had been opened in the early hours before sunrise, when the fog was low and the security camera's motion detection was weakest. He checked the footage anyway. Nothing. Someone had learned the system, understood its limits. A calculated risk. He installed a second camera, this time hidden in a vented birdhouse 20 feet up in the sycamore overlooking the valve hatch. If they came again, they wouldn't walk unseen. 2 nights later, they returned. It was 2:36 a.m. 3 individuals, all dressed in black utility gear, hoods pulled tight, faces obscured. One carried a tool bag. The camera in the tree caught them in full resolution as they approached the hatch, scanned it, and then attempted to pry it open. They worked in silence, efficient and rehearsed. Grayson, already awake with insomnia, received the motion alert and watched from his office in real time. He didn't go outside. He didn't confront them. Instead, he called Jason's after-hours line and left a message. "They're on my land. I have video." Then he called a contact he hadn't used in over a decade, a man who ran a risk assessment firm for high-net-worth clients, not for personal security, but for infrastructure protection. Within the hour, that man, Roland Pierce, called back, reviewed the footage, and said 3 words. "You've been flagged." "What do you mean, flagged?" Grayson asked. Roland explained that certain development entities, especially those with deep-pocket backers, used private intelligence firms to assess obstacles. When those obstacles involved property with uncooperative owners, They ran models: resistance level, political connections, susceptibility to financial pressure, and finally, potential for acquisition through indirect action. Grayson had been identified not just as a landowner, but as a structural risk. That put him in a different category. The visit, Rowland said, wasn't to sabotage. It was to measure the hatch, to assess what tools would be needed, to find a weakness. Grayson hired him the next morning. Rowland's team arrived within 24 hours. 3 vehicles, unmarked, 2 consultants, 1 field engineer. In less than a day, they reinforced the hatch with internal steel braces, installed a weight sensor on the surrounding soil, and planted seismic microvibration detectors beneath the gravel path. Not traps. Detectors. The goal wasn't retaliation. It was evidence. If this became a legal escalation, Grayson wanted a timeline that was irrefutable. He also installed 2 trail cameras in the upper brush where no one would think to look. The lake's water level, in the meantime, had begun to dip subtly. Not enough to panic, but enough to notice. Karen called. He didn't answer. She left a voicemail. "We'd really like to have you at the next Design Council preview. It's important we're all aligned." He saved the voicemail, forwarded it to Jason, and requested the public land use hearing minutes be obtained for all meetings since January. He suspected this had been in motion longer than the demolition suggested. Then came the public pivot. A notice appeared on the town website announcing community safety adjustments to lakeside zones, citing erosion concerns and unanticipated water inconsistency. In parallel, emails were sent to residents warning of possible water conservation periods due to seasonal supply stress. It was the opening volley, an attempt to control the narrative. "You'll make it seem like the lake's instability was a natural problem, one requiring communal sacrifice and, inevitably, new oversight." Grayson, through Jason, submitted a formal objection to the language, noting the existence of a private control system and its compromised state due to unauthorized property destruction. It wasn't loud, but it was permanent, a matter of record. 2 nights after the notice, a rock was thrown through Grayson's side window. Not a big one, but deliberate. It hit the cabinet beside the liquor shelf and shattered the glass. No note, no spray paint, no tag, just a rock. The camera footage was useless. Whoever threw it had stayed just outside the infrared arc. Jason wanted to report it. Grayson refused. "I don't want them knowing what gets under my skin." But it did get under his skin. He began digging, not emotionally, logistically. He had the blueprints of the original water system remodeled in CAD and began cross-referencing pipe age, wear probability, and repair risk. He drafted a protocol for controlled flow shutoff that could be activated remotely. He didn't intend to use it, not yet, but he wanted it ready. Rowland's team ran electromagnetic scans of the hatch. 1 bolt had been tampered with, not fully removed, but stressed, as though someone had begun to work it loose and then stopped. The weight sensors, too, had recorded 2 distinct pressure shifts in the past 72 hours. Someone was testing access, likely in short rotations. It wasn't vandalism, it was strategy. They weren't trying to break in. They were mapping the response time. Grayson responded by going silent. He stopped answering calls, declined to attend any further hearings, and routed all communication through Jason. His land appeared still, untouched, passive. But beneath the surface, it was a minefield of evidence gathering and structural defense. Rowland described it best. They think they're escalating you. In reality, they've just entered a system where you control every variable. A week passed. Then came the letter. Certified. Delivered by courier. A cease and desist. But not to Grayson. Addressed instead to Barclay Water Holdings, LLC, the long-defunct entity that had once managed the water valve before Grayson dissolved it into personal property. The letter claimed that due to demonstrable risk to community wellness, the neighborhood board intended to file for emergency jurisdiction over legacy control systems affecting shared hydrological assets. It was preposterous on its face, but it wasn't designed to win. It was designed to threaten, to push for settlement or force a mistake. Grayson didn't make one. He handed the letter to Jason. Then he walked to the edge of the lake, stared out at the water for a long time, and made a single adjustment to the valve, just enough to lower the flow by another 5%. Just enough to remind them that water doesn't fall from the sky. Not here, not anymore. The lake began to speak for him. Not loudly, not in waves or floods, but in silence. The kind that crept into morning routines and garden conversations, where homeowners found their fountains sputtering, irrigation pumps clicking dry, and koi ponds growing sluggish with algae. The temperature hadn't changed. Rainfall had been average, and yet, bit by bit, the waterline receded in the decorative channel surrounding the manicured lakefront properties. The pristine surface they had all taken for granted grew dull, its mirror sheen dulled by particles that no longer settled, stirred now by wind and discontent. What had been subtle was now undeniable. The neighborhood board scrambled to appear proactive, issuing vague bulletins about maintenance cycles and sediment control, even staging a photo of technicians inspecting an empty PVC housing with clipboards and worried faces. But none of it addressed the core problem because none of them had access to the core, the valve that remained buried beneath Grayson's land, untouched, inaccessible, and most importantly, closed further than it had been in over 40 years. Jason received an email from a junior lawyer representing the board's external counsel, requesting a good faith meeting to resolve the increasing tension regarding shared resource management. Grayson instructed him to accept on one condition. The meeting would not be held at the community center or any board-approved venue. It would take place on his land, on his terms, in the open air by the creek that once naturally fed the lake before human hands re-engineered the flow. Jason relayed this, and to Grayson's mild amusement, they agreed. Perhaps they thought the gesture signaled weakness, an old man eager to negotiate. They hadn't learned a thing. On the morning of the meeting, Grayson did something he rarely did. He dressed with intention. Not to impress, but to provoke a read. He wore his work boots, clay-stained from weeks of trenching near the vineyard, and a dark canvas coat over a collared shirt that had seen sun and sweat. His message was clear. I am not a bureaucrat. I am the land you overlooked. The delegation arrived at 10 sharp, 3 of them, a lead counsel, a board liaison, and, trailing 2 steps behind with her polite armor re-strapped, Karen Holloway. They were escorted not by invitation, but by Roland, whose quiet professionalism and ever-so-subtle delay in unlocking the gate sent its own message. This ground is monitored. They met under a gray sky, the clouds low and heavy but not yet broken. Grayson didn't offer chairs or drinks. He led them to the edge of the hatch, still sealed, still untouched since its reinforcement. There, without preamble, he opened a folder and removed a single document. A notarized letter of custodianship, stamped with the county's seal, confirming sole operational authority of the legacy valve system as a function of private property. Maintenance. He handed it to the lead counsel, who took it without comment but couldn't hide the tension in his jaw as he read. This document, Grayson said, predates your development plan. It predates your rezoning. It predates your committee. And unless challenged in court, which I welcome, it will remain the only operational right of access. Karen shifted. We're not here to argue about history, she said. We're here to find a sustainable path forward for everyone. Grayson turned slightly toward her but didn't soften. You erase that history with a bulldozer, he replied. then called it community enrichment. The air between them held. The council interjected, suggesting a cooperative framework, something that would grant the board emergency override access in cases of environmental necessity, balanced by a compensation structure and partial restoration grant for the barn. Grayson listened. Then he countered, not with demands, but with facts. He recited the 3 unpermitted incursions onto his land, outlined the tampering of infrastructure, and named 2 contractors by company and license number who had participated in unauthorized surveillance. He knew these names not because he investigated personally, but because Rowland's team had traced work orders through insurance filings and invoice ledgers. He concluded with a statement that landed like a closing argument. This isn't about cooperation. It's about containment. You let yourselves believe that your project was inevitable and you acted accordingly. What you didn't account for was resistance grounded in law, not emotion. They left without agreement. But the tone had changed. The next 48 hours unfolded in silence. No new flags, no unmarked vans, no technical assessments. It was the first true lull in weeks. Grayson spent it tightening his perimeter, not with fences, but with systems. Rowland helped him submit a formal infrastructure hazard notice to the State Environmental Agency, citing recent unauthorized interventions that may have compromised historical water equipment. It was a tactical move, not to cause panic but to initiate oversight from someone other than the board. The agency, required to respond within a fixed window, scheduled a preliminary inspection. In parallel, Jason filed a motion with the local court to enjoin any future rezoning action that included Grayson's parcel without explicit consent and public review. The motion itself wasn't the goal. The goal was the injunction, a legal freeze that, once in place, would make any backdoor development maneuver a contemptible act. Grayson then did something that truly rattled the board. He sent letters to a handful of residents. Hope. Not propaganda. Not threats. Just a quiet explanation of the valve system, the nature of his custodianship, and the documented damages caused by the demolition. He didn't call for support or alliances. He offered transparency. Some responded with cautious appreciation. 1 or 2 sent back curt acknowledgments. But one letter, mailed by hand, arrived with no return address. Inside, a photo. The original barn, intact, taken from across the creek during the prior year's autumn harvest. Scribbled on the back in uneven pen. What they did was wrong. They told us it was condemned. That night, Grayson stood by the hatch long after sundown. The air was cool, the stars cloaked by fog, the only sound the gentle churn of low creek water and the soft ticking of the sensor's heartbeat beneath the soil. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't angry. But he was resolved. The halfway point had come and passed. There would be no neutral path now. The valve had become more than a mechanism. It was leverage, not for revenge. For reckoning. Grayson had entered the law with careful precision, but the stillness was only a prelude to the next wave, one that came not in whispers or probes, but in loud, corporate stakes and public posturing. The morning after the Environmental Agency confirmed receipt of his hazard notice, a press release appeared on the Silver Lake Redevelopment Consortium's website and was immediately picked up by local media outlets, describing sudden, urgent water supply issues in the community that threatened structural integrity of lakeside properties, unless emergency jurisdiction over defunct private infrastructure could be obtained. The release featured polished drone footage. Though oddly, the lake looked normal without discoloration, without level issues. Grayson filed screenshots of the footage as evidence, noting that what became urgent in public sounded more like a pre-planned escalation choreographed to divert attention away from the agency's upcoming inspection. He kept his posture unchanged, yet inside he prepared for the shift from legal and logistical conflict to reputational and social confrontation. His first move was not defensive, but proactive. He placed a public notice at the edge of his property, elegantly designed and printed, which read, "Privately maintained water control structure, registered under County Code, Paragraph 47.2E1. Unauthorized entry or tampering is prohibited." It didn't say, "Beware." It didn't say, "Resist." But it turned his property line into a clear legal threshold. Within hours, the weathered sign had sparked online commentary among residents, some voicing surprise, some irritation, others caution. The consortium's press office responded with a terse statement that community safety cannot be compromised by private placement of infrastructure, subtly painting Grayson as the obstruction. He ignored it, knowing that silence backed by fact was more potent than noise. That afternoon, a knock came at his door from a tall woman in a navy blazer carrying a folder stamped with the logo of a major national engineering consultancy. She introduced herself as Dr. Elaine Pierce, a structural specialist brought in by the consortium to conduct an emergency survey of water stability for the entire lakeside mechanical system. She claimed neutral intent and offered to remove her shoes and be shown the hatch location to verify that Grayson's valve was properly seated. His legal and advisor texts warned him against letting her in. He declined courteously, offering instead to share documented maintenance logs and valve diagrams. She hesitated, then left. Within the proprietary consultancy, her report came back as inconclusive, operational controls unclear, confirming that she had never accessed the valve and implying that the lack of data was, by omission, a problem. The consortium cited it in a second press update, calling again for access and supervision. Meanwhile, on the ground, Roland's security system recorded a small, specialized drone flying overhead at 3:12 a.m. above the hatch area. No camera lights, no visible rotors, just a subtle overhead flash and a scan pattern that repeated twice before retreating southward. Logs captured the corporate engineering firm's prior visit and traced its vehicle ID, but drones left no license plates. Roland suggested filing a complaint under FAA UAV privacy rules. Grayson agreed. They submitted the complaint with the drone's flight coordinates and timestamps to both the FAA and the local sheriff's office. Within days, 2 deputy investigators politely knocked on the gate and asked general security questions. As before, Grayson provided general, non-incriminating answers about being a landowner ensuring property privacy. The next escalation came disguised in bureaucracy. A stack of documents arrived at his door via courier. The consortium announced a newly formed Lake Safety Commission, a committee whose jurisdiction, they declared, had been extended to include lands with hydrological impact downstream via an amendment to the covenants recorded with the county records office. The paperwork included a copy of the amended covenant and a signature page bearing what looked to be Grayson's name on an old printed contract, an unnotarized photocopy bearing an inked inscription. It was dated 14 years ago and tied to a parcel description that no longer matched boundary coordinates. He showed the documents to Jason, who confirmed the signature was a forgery and the coordinates manipulated. They prepared a notarized affidavit, submitted an official challenge to the county, and requested a forensic signature analysis. In parallel, Jason filed a court motion to nullify any covenant amendments involving forged documentation. The Lake Safety Commission's launch was now tied to potential fraud, and the case was escalated from administrative to criminal court circuit. That evening, a fireworks display was scheduled at the lakefront. Usually festive, this time it was conspicuous. Boats lined the shore, most empty but with the film crews filming ambient, empty water. It looked like a celebration, but the backdrop felt staged, as if a show put on for cameras to reinforce normalcy. Grayson did not attend. Instead, he watched remotely, noticing that none of the fountains operated during the event, and none of the waterfront lighting systems turned on, despite the festive soundtrack. It was a carefully curated illusion, picturesque by night but cut off from actual function. He took screenshots. In response to his challenge of the covenant and the forensic evidence request, the consortium filed a protective order demanding that Grayson cease all public posts and remove his property sign, citing further reputational damage. Jason filed for a temporary restraining order to protect his right to free speech and property signage. Grayson's phone began receiving anonymous calls, light static and nothing more, always at 3:12 a.m. His email filter flagged identical spam messages, innocuous but sent at exactly 3:12 a.m. Blank subjects, blank bodies. Roland noted that the timestamps matched the drone activity. He slept less, thought more. His mechanical valve routine grew more ritual. Twice daily, under pipe-lit lamp, he checked pressure gauges, cleaned sediment filters, hammered in fuses on the sensor grid, all while reviewing CAD schematics he'd memorized. He knew every gear tooth and calibration curve, the torque coefficients, and the valve's operational envelope. When he adjusted it again, only enough to drop another 2% of flow, barely perceptible but traceable, he logged the change, sealed the log with digital certificate, and kept a time-stamped video note. Valve adjusted to offset unknown internal survey. Timestamp 03.12. It was a record, not a threat. On the 20th day after the breach, Roland located an internal memo leaked from within the consortium's engineering partner, outlining Phase B, data integrity gathering, and naming Grayson's valve by address as the primary risk dampener to projected inflow levels. It was intelligence gathered from the consultancy's report, indicating that someone inside was documenting Grayson explicitly. The memo suggested covert mapping of internal pipe strengths in anticipation of a formal takeover attempt. Roland sent the memo to Jason under seal. The following morning, as news of the Covenant challenge and forensic request hit the local paper, community sentiment began to shift. Neighbors sought Grayson out, some curious, some apologetic. One resident, whose property bordered the lake, left a basket of peaches on his doorstep with a simple note. "Thank you for standing firm." Another, older couple sent a card in elegant calligraphy that read, "You saved our investment, whether you meant to or not." The public narrative was tilting. In direct response, the consortium arranged a staged fundraiser at the Lakeside Pavilion. Wine and hors d'oeuvres offered by uniformed servers under branded canopies. Cameras present. They made speeches about resilience, community spirit, unity in the face of adversity. Grayson did not attend, but his legal and security team monitored the event. Using directional microphones from a concealed point outside the sound perimeter, they recorded multiple board members whispering about that stubborn valve man and how we need to push through or collapse the plan. These comments, though offhand, became part of the discovery file, time-stamped and transcribed. Now, the consortium faced a bind. Push harder and risk public backlash, or back down and lose control. Grayson had gone from being an obstacle to a symbol, and not of disruption, but of accountability and quiet competence. That was their problem now, and it was his advantage. As the second wave of escalation closed, the chessboard shifted completely. They had tried to escalate with media, manipulation, bureaucracy, and intimidation. He had responded with precision, turning every tactic back onto the board as evidence, as leverage, and as narrative fuel. Phase 2 had ended. The next move would be theirs, or their reckoning. Grayson received a brief message from Roland, a confirmation rather than a warning. He understood immediately. This was no longer a waiting game. The pressure that had simmered behind committee doors, legal filings, and property maneuvers had reached its peak. The pretense of caution would be stripped away, replaced by action, coordinated, and desperate. Grayson moved deliberately through his house, stepped outside, and followed the path to the valve hatch, its iron edges now coated with dry dust and fine gravel. He didn't speak or react, just stood there, calm and grounded, because this was exactly the moment he had prepared for. It didn't take long. From the ridge above the service road, Rowland's team confirmed the approach of several vehicles. Official branding had been obscured under generic contractor decals, but the formation, the equipment, the coordinated arrival, all of it made the intent clear. This was an incursion dressed up as inspection, with the unmistakable weight of corporate backing trying to assert dominion over land that didn't belong to them. Grayson didn't move to intercept. He didn't call out or confront. He simply activated the systems they had buried weeks before. Pressure locks under the hatch silently armed, micro-vibration sensors synced to the terminal inside the study, directional microphones keyed to movement within the restricted zone. Rowland monitored from a concealed point along the upper slope, logging each step, each position, every signal. The team fanned out, two advancing toward the valve, one carrying a long pry tool, another holding a scanner. Oh. They carried no permits, no warrants, no authorization. They were not here to observe. They were here to act. As the first metal edge slid beneath the hatch's lip, Grayson released the pressure seal. A burst of vivid green dye erupted from the seam, coating the tool, the technician's gloves, and the surrounding gravel in a visible marker designed for pipe calibration. Non-toxic, but unmistakable. At the same moment, Rowland stepped from cover, camera raised, voice steady. He identified the intrusion, the lack of consent, and the violation of a standing legal injunction that barred any unauthorized activity on the parcel. His words were recorded by 3 separate angles, one of them from an aerial drone already registered with federal clearance. The lead technician froze, not in fear, but in awareness. The color on his hands marked him. The unspoken contract had broken. One of the unmarked vehicle's occupants stepped out, a legal observer trying to remain uninvolved but now caught in the footage, holding a folder of papers he never had the chance to present. Grayson remained silent. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. The system worked. The trap was legal, not violent. They had crossed a line they could not now erase. From a nearby ridge, Rowland's team captured audio from one of the contractors whispering into a phone, clearly aware they were being recorded. Grayson stepped back, leaving them there, exposed under an open sky, standing over a sealed hatch they had failed to breach. Jason, already monitoring the footage remotely, initiated a formal filing against the consortium. A motion for contempt was entered into court records, backed by timestamps, footage, and sensor logs. A sheriff's vehicle was dispatched, not to arrest, but to document. Statements were taken, names were logged, vehicle IDs were recorded. No one resisted. No one spoke. The legality of the incursion was now in question not only as a civil breach, but as a potential criminal violation. Karen Holloway's name appeared in the coordination memo that had authorized the field operation, now attached as an appendix in the court filing. The public narrative could no longer be shaped with press releases and curated drone videos. It had entered the courtroom. The consortium issued a vague press statement disavowing unauthorized actions. The website's committee page disappeared. The development partners halted progress on the Boardwalk initiative. In internal emails later leaked to Grayson's legal team, several board members expressed concern about personal liability. Grayson's legal position had transformed from defensive to dominant. The documents he submitted, every gauge log, every boundary recording, every incident report, formed a lattice of undeniable evidence. The court set a preliminary hearing. Witnesses were subpoenaed. Meanwhile, Rowland's footage was quietly passed to a select few journalists known for detailed local reporting. Within a few days, The silence Grayson had wielded for so long began to shift the public perception. He was no longer just a landowner in dispute. He became a figure of lawful resistance, a man who had refused to yield when others might have folded, who had not screamed or postured or threatened but had acted with precision, calm, and absolute authority. At the lake, the waterline told its own story. Along the stone border, streaks of mineral buildup exposed how much had receded. The fountains remained off. The planned events were postponed. And yet, no one could accuse him of sabotage. The flow had not been cut. It had been adjusted, lawfully, under his custodial rights. Every alteration had been logged, certified, and time-stamped. His valve remained untouched, protected beneath reinforced metal, now visibly marked by the bright green stain of failure. Back at home, he didn't celebrate. There was no joy in being right, no triumph in exposing bad actors. What there was stillness, the kind that follows when people finally stop pushing because they realize the wall they've hit will not move. He stood at the edge of his property, watching the lake in the distance, not as a battleground, but as a consequence. They had reached the edge of what their strategy allowed. He hadn't forced them back. They had undone themselves. And now, at last, they would have to live in the world they had tried to control. In the weeks that followed, the intensity unraveled not through conflict but through silence, a kind of withdrawal that spoke more about guilt than strategy. The consortium ceased all external communications, their website stripped to a single static banner reading, "Under Review," and every initiative involving the lakeside was marked, "Delayed indefinitely." There were no more survey flags, no vans idling. Near the service road, no veiled offers disguised as committee notices or partnership proposals. Grayson no longer received strange calls, and the anonymous email spam stopped altogether. It was as if, having pushed every boundary they could fabricate and still been met with resolute, silent resistance, the entire machinery simply collapsed under its own fraudulence. And yet, he took no comfort in that. What remained wasn't satisfaction or closure, but a deep and sober understanding of what it cost to hold one's ground when powerful people believed they had the right to steal it. The legal process pressed on, slowly but with increasing certainty. Jason had compiled the entire sequence of events into a formidable case file. Each unauthorized visit, each act of tampering, the forged documents, the staged covenant amendments, the court violations, and the corroborating evidence from Rowland's team. The contempt motion advanced, and discovery requests were answered with terse, fearful admissions. When the forensic document examiner submitted her final report to the court, confirming that Grayson's signature on the supposed agreement had been digitally fabricated from an earlier inspection record, the mood shifted even further. The county clerk's office quietly opened an inquiry into how such a document had been accepted into the land registry. A private apology was offered by one of the deputy administrators. Jason advised Grayson to keep it for the record. Karen Holloway, once omnipresent at every development forum, every community initiative, disappeared entirely from view. No official statement was made about her position, but she was removed from the consortium's listings and replaced on committee filings with an interim representative who refused all media interviews. Rumors circled about pending civil liabilities, including the possibility of personal financial exposure due to authorizing activity outside policy bounds. Grayson paid little attention to that. He wasn't after anyone's ruin. He was after the truth and the restoration of boundaries, legal, physical, and ethical. The lake, now noticeably lower, settled into a strange stillness. Not dead, but exposed. Its artificiality could no longer be ignored. Algae began to bloom in thin strands along the eastern banks. Ornamental grasses yellowed. Decorative retaining walls began to show the first signs of stress cracking. The boardwalk's piling stood above waterline, stark and skeletal. The illusion was broken. People began walking the edge of the lake with slower steps. Questions no longer revolved around when the development would resume, but whether it had ever been wise to interfere with what was never theirs to control in the first place. Some residents sent quiet acknowledgments to Grayson. Others said nothing, but stopped frowning when they saw him. The hostility that once clung to his independence gave way to a reluctant understanding, then respect. They didn't need to like him. They just had to understand he wasn't the enemy. He was the wall they'd never seen coming. Grayson, meanwhile, returned to habit. He spent more time restoring the paths around the creek, pruning trees, stabilizing the barn's old footprint with new stone salvaged from the demolition debris. He never rebuilt the barn in its original form. Instead, he repurposed the cleared space into a small open grove, planting a ring of live oaks and installing a bench facing the lake. A single stone marker stood near the center, inscribed not with a quote or name, but a series of survey coordinates, the exact point where the valve system sat beneath. It wasn't symbolic. It was literal. A quiet reminder that control over water and land and legacy does not belong to those who scream loudest or build the fastest. It belongs to those who hold the records, walk the perimeter, document the intrusion, and refuse to step aside. The final court ruling came without drama. The judge affirmed the injunction, voided the falsified covenant, and authorized a claim for compensatory damages. The consortium did not appeal. They issued a final notice to stakeholders, dissolving their Lakeside Committee and returning all pending permits to inactive status. Grayson declined the monetary offer attached to the settlement. Instead, he requested a formal statement of retraction and acknowledgement of unlawful demolition, to be recorded in county files and referenced in any future development review involving adjacent parcels. The board conceded. With the valve still in place under his full and uncontested control, Grayson turned the system back to steady flow. Not to punish, not to reward, but because it was right. The lake rose again, slowly, honestly, without flourish. The fountains resumed. The fish returned to deeper waters. No one thanked him. He didn't expect it. But no one touched his land again. And in that silence, he understood something simple but absolute. It wasn't the valve that gave him power. It was his refusal to yield when they expected him to. It was his ability to outlast their schemes not through anger, but through truth, law, and unshakable patience. They had underestimated the man who controlled the flow, thinking he was just a leftover relic standing in the way of progress. But he wasn't in the way. He was the foundation, and now they knew it.